A respected hospital leader comes to the ER with serious pain, but the doctor ignores her, not knowing who she really is. Her journey reveals the problems in the system, leading to a powerful change that no one expected. Dr. Renee Carter started her day early, as she often did, going through her morning routine with calm precision. Her home was warm and orderly, each room reflecting her character, focused, diligent, and in control. As she sipped her coffee, she scanned her phone for messages. Even early in the morning, her inbox was full, a mixture of meeting reminders, emails from colleagues, and updates on various hospital initiatives. She was accustomed to the fast pace and the endless demands of her position as the head of the hospital board, a title she wore with quiet pride. Today, however, a persistent ache gnawed at her side, an odd, deep discomfort that she tried to ignore. As the morning unfolded, the ache didn't subside. Instead, it grew sharper, more insistent, until Renee found herself clutching her side, leaning against her desk as the pain surged. She took a deep breath, her fingers lightly pressing the spot where the pain pulsed. She knew her body well enough to recognize when something was wrong, and this pain was different, more intense, unyielding. She reached for her phone, hesitated for a moment, then dialed the hospital to arrange a visit to the emergency room. It felt strange, vulnerable even, to step out of her usual role of decision-maker and become a patient, but the pain gave her no choice. Arriving at the hospital, Renee walked through the familiar halls, her steps slightly slower than usual, each one feeling more laborious. The bustling atmosphere of the hospital was as she remembered, urgent and full of movement. She registered herself quietly, feeling a slight sense of detachment as she moved from her usual world of board meetings and strategic discussions into the waiting area, where patients sat with tired eyes and anxious expressions. Despite the pain that twisted inside her, she offered a polite nod to the receptionist, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs. She glanced around, noting how out of place she felt on this side of the hospital, a place she rarely visited, but one she knew held its own stories, its own struggles. Minutes turned into an hour, and the pain grew sharper, almost clawing through her. A nurse finally guided her to a small room, checking her vitals with a quick efficiency that left Renee feeling like just another body in the system, waiting to be analyzed and moved along. She asked if Dr. Thomas Richards would be attending to her, and the nurse confirmed it with a smile. Renee nodded, trying to steady her breathing as she waited. The minutes dragged on, each one marked by a new wave of pain that seemed to tighten its grip on Renee's side. She shifted uncomfortably on the examination bed, her hands pressing against the cold sheet beneath her, trying to focus on anything but the ache radiating through her body. Just as she closed her eyes, attempting to steel herself, she heard the door swing open. Dr. Thomas Richards entered with a brisk stride, barely glancing at her as he flipped through her chart. His white coat was immaculate, his movements swift and practiced, carrying an air of certainty that seemed almost dismissive. "Miss Carter," he said without looking up, his tone efficient and detached. "What seems to be the issue today?" Renee held back a wince at the sound of her name. She cleared her throat, carefully explaining the pain, describing how it had started as a dull ache and had intensified over the past few hours. She spoke with clarity, detailing her symptoms with a practiced precision, avoiding any hint of dramatics. But Dr. Richards seemed uninterested in the specifics. His eyes were on his clipboard, his pen scratching quick notes without pause as if her words were barely registering. He murmured, finally glancing up with a quick assessing look. "This kind of pain. It's not uncommon, especially in someone who's, well," he hesitated, gesturing vaguely, "under a lot of stress. You mentioned you have a demanding job, right?" Renee's jaw tightened slightly, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze. She explained that while her work was indeed intense, she knew her body and was certain this pain wasn't simply stress. Dr. Richards offered a slight, polite smile, but she could see in his eyes that he had already formed his conclusion. "Look," he said, softening his tone just a little as if explaining something obvious. "We see this a lot. High-achieving individuals, especially women, sometimes experience physical symptoms that are rooted in stress. It's probably nothing serious, just your body's way of telling you to slow down." His words were delivered with a confidence that left little room for argument, his tone almost patronizing. Renee felt her stomach twist, the pain momentarily overshadowed by a growing frustration. She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Richards, but this pain isn't something I've felt before. It's deeper, and it's getting worse." She tried to keep her voice calm, professional, but there was an edge to it that she couldn't quite mask. Dr. Richards let out a soft sigh, the kind that suggested he had already made up his mind. "I'll order some basic tests, just in case, but it's likely stress-related," he said, scribbling on his clipboard, before nodding curtly and stepping out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Renee alone, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh, impersonal glow. She sat there, feeling the coldness of the examination room seeping into her skin, a strange mix of anger and helplessness washing over her. She had come here trusting the system, trusting that she would be heard. But in that brief interaction, it was as if her concerns had been diminished to a mere inconvenience. Renee sat there in silence, the coldness of the examination room amplifying the discomfort gnawing at her side. Minutes passed, then stretched into nearly an hour, each moment weighed down by her growing frustration and pain. She shifted on the bed, gritting her teeth as another wave of sharp discomfort gripped her. The initial anger she felt toward Dr. Richards was now blending with something heavier, a sense of vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Her breaths came in shallow pulls as she tried to center herself, willing the pain to ease up even slightly. Finally, the door creaked open, and a young nurse entered, her expression neutral and professional. She glanced at Renee's chart, then at the few notes Dr. Richards had jotted down. "Dr. Richards has ordered some preliminary tests," the nurse said, her voice soft but detached, almost as if she were used to delivering news without personal connection. "We'll take you for blood work and a quick scan." Renee nodded, suppressing a sigh. She followed the nurse out of the room, walking down the sterile hallways, past patients and staff who were too busy with their own lives to notice her presence. She could feel herself slipping into an uncomfortable numbness, the kind she often saw in others as they tried to navigate a complex healthcare system. She had advocated for change within this very hospital, worked tirelessly to make things more efficient, more compassionate, but now that she was on the other side, she could feel the disconnect acutely. After the blood draw, she was led to another waiting room, this one colder, filled with patients who looked as worn and tired as she felt. Hours had passed since she first arrived, and the pain was becoming unbearable, but she tried to maintain her composure, focusing on breathing evenly as she sat in the hard plastic chair. Every so often she glanced at the clock, each tick making her patience fray a little more. Just as her resolve was beginning to crack, she saw Dr. Richards through the glass partition, casually speaking with a group of colleagues. He laughed at something one of them said, his face relaxed and entirely untroubled. A pang of resentment stabbed through her as she watched him. How could he stand there so carefree while she was left in limbo, her pain dismissed as though it were nothing more than a product of her busy life? When he finally made his way back to her, there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the wait. He barely looked her in the eye as he skimmed the results, flipping through the pages with a disinterested expression. "Your tests look mostly normal," he said, a hint of irritation lacing his words. "Nothing here is giving us a cause for concern. Like I said earlier, this is likely stress-induced. I'd recommend some rest, maybe consider taking a few days off work." Renee's fists clenched subtly at her sides. She took a steadying breath, then spoke with measured calm. "I understand your perspective, Dr. Richards, but I know my body. This isn't just stress, the pain is intensifying, and it's not something I can simply dismiss." He raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting into something almost condescending. "Ms. Carter," he replied, his voice laced with faint impatience, "sometimes when we're busy and under pressure, our bodies react in ways we don't always understand. I'm sure a little rest will make all the difference." She bit back the retort on her tongue, swallowing the bitter taste of frustration. "Is there anything else you can do? Any other tests or scans?" Dr. Richards shrugged, a flicker of irritation flashing across his face. "There's nothing else I'd recommend at this stage. If it persists, you could make an appointment with your primary care physician, but honestly, there's not much more to explore here." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Renee standing there, her pain and frustration twisting into something deeper. She watched him disappear down the hall, feeling a quiet resolve hardening within her. Renee's resolve crystallized as she stood in that hallway, the faint hum of hospital activity surrounding her. She felt a pang of disbelief at how easily her pain and her voice had been dismissed, reduced to nothing more than a trivial inconvenience. There was a time, not so long ago, when she might have brushed off an experience like this as a single oversight, a moment of human error. But today, her pain was raw and real, and the dismissal cut deeper than ever before. She knew she couldn't simply leave, not when the pain was still gnawing at her side, as fierce and unyielding as her frustration. She returned to the waiting area, her movements slow, each step sending a dull throb through her body. Taking a seat in a quieter corner, Renee tried to refocus her thoughts, to keep herself grounded. Memories of the countless board meetings she'd chaired in this very hospital floated into her mind. She thought about the discussions on patient-centered care, on the hospital's mission to treat every individual with dignity and empathy. The irony stung, and she found herself wondering how many others had been dismissed just as she had, their voices lost in the endless shuffle of hurried consultations and assumptions. Just then, a young intern passed by, glancing over at her with an uncertain expression. He hesitated, then approached, recognizing her face. "Dr. Carter, are you all right? I didn't expect to see you here as a patient," he said, his voice tentative, almost reverent. The intern's voice was tinged with genuine concern, a stark contrast to the detached manner she'd faced all day. Renee managed a small, tired smile, grateful for his kindness. "I'm all right, thank you," she replied, though the pain under her calm exterior told a different story. "Just here for some persistent issues." The intern nodded, looking around as if ensuring no one was listening. I don't mean to overstep, Dr. Carter, but if you're not getting the answers you need, I could speak to someone. Maybe suggest another set of tests or a second opinion." Touched by his offer, Renee felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you. I think I may take you up on that." She paused, then added, "It's frustrating when you're not being heard." The intern's face softened with understanding. "I can imagine," he said quietly, as if he, too, had witnessed similar moments. "Sometimes it's easy to forget that even the people who run this place need care, too." His words resonated with her, and she found herself nodding, her earlier frustration tempered by his empathy. But as the intern left to seek out additional help, she was struck by an undeniable truth. The very system she helped govern was failing her, revealing cracks in a structure she had once believed in. She sat alone, waiting, the pain a constant reminder that her own hospital, a place she had worked so hard to improve, was now her source of neglect. Renee sat quietly, the young intern's kindness lingering in her mind, offering a sliver of reassurance amidst the mounting frustration. But as the minutes stretched into another hour, the sliver faded, and the pain clawed back with renewed intensity. Her breathing grew shallow as she tried to find a comfortable position, but each adjustment seemed to bring only sharper discomfort. She glanced around the waiting area, watching other patients move through the system with varying levels of urgency. She had seen this scene so many times before, but from the other side, as a decision-maker, not as someone in need. Finally, the intern returned, his expression apologetic, his shoulders slightly slumped. "I'm sorry, Doctor. Carter," he began, glancing down as he spoke. "Dr. Richards isn't authorizing any additional tests right now. He believes that, well, that nothing serious is showing up on the initial results." Renee nodded, the words sinking in with a familiar weight. She managed a polite, though pained, smile. "I appreciate your effort." "Thank you," she replied, her tone steady despite the frustration gnawing inside her. The intern lingered for a moment, looking troubled. "I tried to explain that you were still in pain, but he insisted that stress might be the main factor here." Renee's hands clenched subtly in her lap. She felt the familiar burn of indignation, but this time it was edged with something deeper, a raw, simmering anger that she hadn't felt in years. She knew her own body. She knew this was no ordinary discomfort, no passing ailment to be shrugged off with a vague excuse. She was too familiar with the ways people could be misjudged, too aware of the quiet, insidious biases that sometimes wormed their way into decisions meant to be impartial. The intern lowered his voice. "If you'd like," he offered hesitantly, "I could call one of the other attending doctors. Sometimes a different perspective can—" "That's kind of you," she interrupted gently, "but I don't want to cause trouble." She gave him a reassuring nod, though inside she was wavering. In her role as head of the board, she had always encouraged teamwork, had championed the idea of collaboration and respect between staff. Yet here she was, experiencing firsthand how a single judgment could sideline a patient's concerns. The intern nodded, clearly reluctant but respectful of her decision. "Of course, Dr. Carter. But if there's anything else I can do, just let me know." As he walked away, Renee felt a pang of regret, wishing she hadn't brushed him off so easily. But she was tired, too tired to keep pushing when every effort seemed to fall on deaf ears. She glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing she had been at the hospital for nearly half the day. Yet she was no closer to answers than when she had first walked in. As the hours continued to slip by, Renee's frustration grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The once familiar hospital halls now felt foreign, almost hostile, each passing moment making her feel more invisible. The pain in her side throbbed relentlessly, a sharp reminder of her helplessness in a place she should have felt protected. She had always believed in this hospital, trusted its staff, and fought for policies that would improve patient care. Now, that trust felt misplaced, and the irony was bitter. Just when she thought she couldn't sit still any longer, Dr. Richards reappeared, his face betraying a faint hint of annoyance. He carried a stack of charts, flipping through them absent-mindedly, before glancing up at her with an expression that was almost exasperated. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone clipped, "I thought we discussed that stress might be a likely cause of your discomfort. I don't see the need to pursue further diagnostics at this point." Renee met his gaze, her own eyes steady and unwavering. Despite the pain, she sat up straighter, carefully choosing her words. "Dr. Richards, with all due respect, I'm aware of my own stress levels. This pain is not just a symptom of a busy schedule or a restless mind. It's real and it's worsening." He gave a slight shake of his head, the corner of his mouth pulling into a tight, dismissive smile. "Look, I've been in this field long enough to recognize the patterns," he replied, his tone growing more patronizing with each word. "Stress can manifest in many ways. Sometimes we think it's something serious, but it turns out to be nothing more than tension." Renee felt a spark of anger flare within her. She had witnessed many doctors in her time, and she knew this type well. the kind who believed their judgment was infallible, who saw challenges to their authority as nuisances rather than opportunities to learn. But in that moment she kept her composure, channeling her frustration into a cool, measured response. "I respect your experience, Dr. Richards, but I would still like another opinion. This pain is interfering with my ability to function, and I won't ignore it." He sighed, glancing down at her chart again as if searching for some hidden clue that would validate his own assessment. "Fine," he said finally, his voice curt. "I can arrange for another scan, but I'm telling you it's unlikely to reveal anything." The word stung, layered with doubt and dismissal, yet Renee knew this was as close to cooperation as she was likely to get from him. She nodded, her expression unyielding. "Thank you," she said simply, holding his gaze for a moment longer before he turned and left the room without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, Renee let out a slow, shaky breath. She felt a strange mix of relief and frustration, knowing that while she had finally been granted another test, it was only through sheer persistence. The pain remained, sharp and unrelenting, but her resolve was firmer now. She would see this through, no matter how many barriers were placed in her way. Renee lay on the cold metal table in the dimly lit imaging room, waiting as the technician prepared the machine for her scan. She stared up at the ceiling, focusing on her breathing. Each inhale and exhale a small attempt to push the pain aside, if only temporarily. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the machine as it warmed up. She could feel the weight of exhaustion settling over her, but she forced herself to stay alert, to keep her mind focused on what was happening. She didn't want to miss a single detail, knowing that every interaction, every word exchanged, would matter. The technician, a young woman with kind eyes, gave her a reassuring nod before explaining the process. Her voice was calm and patient, a refreshing change from the condescending tone she'd endured all day. "We'll start with a few basic scans, Doctor. Carter, it shouldn't take too long. Just try to stay as still as possible, and let me know if you feel any discomfort." Renee managed a faint smile, grateful for the small gesture of respect. She lay still as the machine began its slow, mechanical hum, the sound filling the room as it worked. Her mind wandered to her responsibilities, to the meetings she was missing, to the people who were counting on her. She thought of her role on the board, all the hours spent shaping policies to ensure that patients received timely, compassionate care. She wondered how many patients had sat in her place, feeling unheard, pushed aside, while the system they trusted moved on without them. The scan proceeded in silence, the minutes stretching on as the machine moved slowly over her. Each pulse of sound felt like a marker, a reminder of the time slipping away, of her day lost to waiting and pleading for acknowledgement. She could feel a pang of doubt creeping in, whispering that maybe this was all for nothing, that she would leave this hospital without answers, only more questions. When the scan was finally over, the technician helped her sit up, offering a supportive hand as she eased off the table. "We'll get these results to Dr. Richards shortly, Doctor. Carter," the technician said with a reassuring smile. "It shouldn't be too long." "Thank you," Renee replied, her voice soft but grateful. She made her way back to the waiting area, the ache in her side now sharper, more insistent. As she sat down, she tried to quell the growing wave of impatience, reminding herself that answers would come soon. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Richards would find some way to dismiss these results too, to make them fit his narrative of stress and overwork. The minutes stretched on again, the ticking of the clock a constant reminder of her helplessness in this situation. She shifted in her seat, trying to find some semblance of comfort, but the hard plastic chair offered no relief. The waiting was becoming unbearable, each second amplifying her frustration, the pain and the quiet indignation simmering beneath it all. Finally, Dr. Richards appeared again, holding her scan results in his hands. His expression was neutral, unreadable as he approached. She searched his face for any sign of concern, any hint of empathy, but his eyes remained detached, almost clinical. "Dr. Carter," he began, glancing at the scans briefly before looking back at her. "As I suspected, there's nothing here that would explain your symptoms. The scans came back normal." Renee felt the words hit her like a cold gust of wind, each one slicing through the hope she had clung to. She could barely suppress the frustration building inside her. "Dr. Richards," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I understand that the scans may not show anything obvious, but this pain is real. I need you to consider other possibilities." He gave her a thin, tight-lipped smile. "Miss Carter, sometimes our bodies play tricks on us, especially under pressure. I strongly advise you to rest and consider taking some time off." The words echoed in her mind, hollow and dismissive, leaving her feeling smaller and more invisible with each passing second. She had exhausted every option, pushed for every test, but it felt as though she were talking to a wall, her concerns slipping away unheard. "Renee sat there, Doctor," Richards's words settling around her like a heavy fog. Her mind raced, alternating between frustration and disbelief. She felt drained, not just by the pain, but by the relentless effort it had taken simply to be acknowledged. For a moment she considered giving up, letting the numbness swallow her, but a quiet strength within her pushed back. She couldn't leave without answers, not after everything she'd endured in this place she'd once trusted to care for others. Summoning the last of her resolve, Renee looked Dr. Richards directly in the eye. "Doctor Richards," she began, her voice calm yet steely. "I've spent my career advocating for patient-centered care in this hospital. I know what it means to truly listen to someone, to understand that their experience and their pain are valid, regardless of what the tests may show. This pain is affecting my life. I'm not asking for miracles. I'm asking for you to see me as a person who deserves thorough care." Dr. Richards shifted uncomfortably, a flash of something unreadable crossing his face. "Miss Carter, I understand your frustration," he replied, his tone softening slightly, though still carrying a hint of impatience. "But from a medical standpoint, there's no evidence to justify further investigation. I'm confident that rest will alleviate your symptoms." Renee's heart sank. She had laid herself bare, spoken her truth as plainly as she could, and yet, here he was, still unmoved, still fixed in his assumptions. A sense of finality settled over her, and she realized there was nothing more she could say that would make him see her as anything other than an inconvenience. She wanted to argue, to push further, but the weight of exhaustion held her back. She had nothing left to give. Without another word, Dr. Richards turned and left, leaving her alone once more, his figure disappearing into the bustling corridor. Renee sat in silence, her mind numb, her body still pulsing with that persistent, unyielding pain. She felt adrift, untethered from the hospital she had once held in such high regard. The irony was almost too much to bear, that the very institution she had fought so hard to improve had now become the source of her greatest disillusionment. As she prepared to gather her things and leave, the young intern appeared again, his face etched with worry. He paused, hesitant, then approached. "Dr. Carter," he said quietly, "I'm sorry things turned out this way. I know you deserved better than this." Renee looked at him, the sincerity in his eyes cutting through the numbness that had settled over her. She managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she replied softly. "Sometimes it's enough just to be seen." The intern hesitated, then spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "If there's anything I can do, outside of all this," he gestured to the hospital around them, "please let me know. I believe you, Dr. Carter." Those words, simple and sincere, touched something deep within her. For the first time all day, she felt a glimmer of validation, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her struggle. She nodded, unable to speak, and the intern gave her a respectful nod before slipping away, leaving her with the quiet echo of his words. As she walked out of the hospital, her steps slow and measured, Renee felt the weight of the experience settle heavily on her shoulders. She had come here as a patient in need, but she was leaving with something else, a renewed understanding of the quiet battles people fought daily, the struggles that often went unseen. And with each step she resolved that this wouldn't be the end of her story. She would make sure no one else felt dismissed, unseen, or unheard in this hospital again. As Renee exited the hospital, a wave of fatigue washed over her, but there was a simmering determination underneath, something sharp and resolute. The evening air was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the sterile, indifferent atmosphere she had left behind. She paused for a moment, looking back at the towering building that she had once regarded as a place of hope and healing. Now, it loomed before her as a symbol of indifference, a reminder of the systemic biases that had, in one grueling day, shifted from a distant issue to a deeply personal reality. Back at home, she allowed herself a moment to rest, sinking into her favorite chair, the ache in her side still present but muted, at least for now. She considered her options, her mind sifting through the faces she had seen today, the fleeting moments where empathy had slipped through the cracks. Like the young intern's sincere gaze, his quiet offer to help. She thought about how different her experience could have been if even one person had fully listened, if Dr. Richards had looked beyond his assumptions. The pain, she realized, wasn't just in her body anymore. It had settled somewhere deeper, pushing her toward action. The next morning, Renee woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The lingering pain in her side reminded her of the urgency she felt, the need to act, not just for herself but for every patient who might find themselves dismissed or disregarded. She made a few calls, arranging for an independent specialist to examine her, but her mind was already racing with ideas beyond her own health. After her appointment, she returned to the hospital, this time not as a patient but in her professional capacity as chair of the board. Her presence commanded attention, and whispers trailed her as she walked through the hallways. The staff she encountered offered polite nods and murmured greetings, oblivious to her recent ordeal within those very walls. She felt a twinge of irony, almost a sense of surrealism, knowing that just a day before, she had been another face in the waiting room, an ordinary patient lost in the shuffle. When she reached the boardroom, she took a deep breath and entered. Her colleagues already gathered around the long table, exchanging polite smiles and greetings. She returned them with a calm expression, but her mind was focused, sharp. Today's agenda included routine updates, but Renee had something else in mind. As the meeting began, she waited patiently for her turn, listening to the usual reports and financial updates with an attentive gaze. When the room quieted, all eyes turned to her, expecting the usual agenda items. But Renee leaned forward, her expression serious, a flicker of steely resolve in her eyes. "Before we continue," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I need to address an issue I encountered firsthand in our hospital yesterday. A failure of empathy and care that shook me, not only as a patient, but as a leader in this institution." Her colleagues exchanged curious, slightly uneasy glances, sensing the weight in her words. She continued, her tone measured but unwavering, recounting her experience in vivid detail, each dismissal, each moment of condescension, building a picture that was hard to ignore. She described the exhaustion, the frustration, the emotional toll that she endured, not to evoke sympathy, but to illuminate a serious problem in their healthcare culture. As she spoke, she saw the shift in the room, the dawning realization on her colleagues' faces, some glancing down, others nodding in understanding. When she finished, she paused, letting her words settle into the silence that followed. We can't continue to allow biases, assumptions, or indifference to cloud our judgment. This isn't just a procedural flaw, it's a human one, and it's our responsibility to address it. The following morning, Renee walked into the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. Dressed impeccably in her professional attire, she moved through the familiar corridors with a quiet determination. Nurses, doctors, and administrative staff offered her polite nods and greetings, many of them unaware of her experience just the day before. To them, she was the respected head of the board, a woman who held significant influence over hospital policies and decisions. But today, she felt like much more. She was also an advocate for every patient who might have been dismissed, ignored, or misjudged within these walls. As she approached the boardroom, she paused outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. Her mind replayed the events of the previous day, the dismissive tone, the hollow explanations, the moments when her pain had been brushed aside as though it were insignificant. She knew her words today would carry weight, but she wanted them to spark genuine change, not just temporary adjustments or apologies. Taking a steadying breath, she opened the door and stepped inside. The room was already filled with board members, their voices hushed as they exchanged morning pleasantries. They greeted her warmly, some standing as a gesture of respect, but Renee only offered a slight nod, her focus sharp. Once everyone had settled, she began with the standard agenda, moving through routine items with a professionalism that kept the room engaged. But beneath her calm exterior, there was an urgency building, a need to share her story that she knew couldn't be delayed much longer. When the usual reports were completed, she took a brief pause, letting the room settle into silence before she spoke again. "Before we adjourn, I have something personal I need to address," she began, her voice steady but with an unmistakable gravity. The shift in her tone drew the attention of every person in the room, their eyes focused on her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Renee recounted her experience in detail, from her arrival in the emergency room to the final dismissive words of Dr. Richards. She spoke of the pain, the hours of waiting, the young intern's brief moments of empathy, and the crushing sense of invisibility she had felt. She didn't raise her voice, didn't embellish or exaggerate, but the truth of her story filled the room with a palpable tension. Her colleagues listened intently, their expressions shifting from surprise to discomfort, and finally to a shared sense of recognition. She saw it in their faces, the realization that this wasn't just an isolated incident, but a reflection of deeper, systemic issues within the hospital. As Renee's story hung in the air, a heavy silence settled over the boardroom. She looked around, meeting the gaze of each person at the table, allowing the weight of her words to resonate. Her colleagues shifted uncomfortably, some glancing down, others nodding slowly, the gravity of her experience settling in. She could see the dawning realization in their eyes, that this wasn't just about one patient's bad experience, but a systemic problem within the very institution they had all pledged to uphold. Clearing her throat, she continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me. Yesterday, I had the privilege, if you can call it that, of experiencing what countless patients likely endure here every day. We talk about compassion, about patient-centered care, but in practice, it seems we are missing something vital. The assumptions, the dismissiveness, and the sheer lack of empathy I encountered should not exist within these walls." One of the board members, an older man who had worked with Renee for years, leaned forward, a troubled look on his face. "Dr. Carter, we're deeply sorry you had this experience. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been, especially given your position here. But surely this is an isolated incident, perhaps a matter of individual error on Dr. Richards's part?" Renee shook her head, a faint but resolute smile tugging at her lips. "That's precisely the problem. This isn't about one doctor, one interaction. This is about a culture that allows assumptions and biases to slip into the care we provide. I wasn't seen for my symptoms. I was seen through the lens of someone else's judgment. And if it happened to me, someone who knows this hospital inside out, it's happening to others who don't have the same voice or platform to advocate for themselves. Her words seemed to cut through any remaining doubt, and she saw a shift in the expressions around her, an acknowledgement that this issue was more pervasive than they had realized. She continued, "We need to put policies in place that reinforce the importance of listening to each patient, not as a procedural step but as a fundamental part of care. Empathy shouldn't be an optional add-on. It should be a core expectation, and we, as leaders, must set that standard." Murmurs of agreement filled the room, and she sensed a shared commitment beginning to form among her colleagues. They weren't just hearing her, they were understanding the depth of the problem, beginning to see it through her eyes. One of the board members, a woman known for her advocacy work, spoke up, her voice filled with determination. "Dr. Carter, I think it's clear that we need to act. Perhaps it's time to implement mandatory training on implicit bias and communication skills for all medical staff starting from the top, and regular assessments to ensure these standards are actually practiced." Renee nodded, feeling a surge of relief mixed with gratitude. "That's a start," she agreed. "But it must go beyond training. We need accountability measures, checks and balances that encourage an environment where every patient is treated with respect and care, where voices aren't just heard, but valued." With those final words, Renee sensed that the momentum had shifted. They weren't just discussing change, they were committing to it. And for the first time since her ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope that this hospital could, indeed, become the place of healing she had always believed it could be. The boardroom was alive with purpose now, each member energized by the vision Renee had set forth. As the conversation evolved, specific ideas started to take shape, practical steps they could implement to ensure meaningful change. Suggestions flowed, each one building upon the last, as the board members brainstormed ways to transform patient care from a checklist of protocols into a genuine, empathetic experience. One board member, a former physician with a deep respect for data, proposed, "We should gather feedback directly from our patients after each visit, anonymous surveys that let them voice concerns or praises honestly. It would give us insight straight from those we serve, highlighting both our successes and our failures." Renee nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And perhaps we could follow up with patients who express dissatisfaction," she added. "A simple call or outreach would not only help address their concerns but also show that we're truly listening and willing to improve based on their experiences." Another board member chimed in, "What about establishing a patient advocate position? Someone trained specifically to assist patients who feel unheard, a resource for those who might not know how to navigate the system on their own." This suggestion sparked excitement, and several members voiced their support. Renee felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she saw the ideas take root. Her colleagues were no longer focused solely on policies or the hospital's bottom line. They were thinking about real people, about the importance of respect and humanity in healthcare. As the discussion continued, Renee noticed a change in herself as well. The frustration, hurt, and disappointment that had weighed her down since her experience as a patient began to ease, replaced by a quiet pride in the work they were now undertaking. This wasn't just a policy discussion. It was the beginning of a cultural shift, one that might finally align their practices with the ideals they had always strived to uphold. At one point, the board member who had initially questioned whether her experience was an isolated incident spoke up again, his voice tinged with humility. "I see now, Dr. Carter. I see how easy it is for us to overlook these things until we're forced to confront them. You've opened my eyes, and I think we all owe you a great deal for sharing your experience with us." Renee offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she replied. "But this isn't about gratitude. It's about doing what's right. If we can make even one patient feel truly seen and cared for, then it will have been worth it." With the meeting drawing to a close, Renee proposed they formalize these ideas into a comprehensive plan, with timelines, responsibilities, and measurable goals. They agreed unanimously, and a sense of unity and determination filled the room. As they dispersed, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a quiet confidence that their work was only just beginning, but that it was leading them in the right direction. As the board members left the room, Renee lingered, allowing herself a moment to absorb the impact of what had just transpired. The room was quiet now, the echo of their commitments and resolutions still lingering in the air. She felt a powerful blend of relief and purpose, knowing that her experience hadn't been in vain and that change was truly on the horizon. As she gathered her things to leave, she heard a familiar voice from behind her. Turning, she saw Dr. Richards standing in the doorway, his expression reserved, though there was a hint of something else, perhaps regret or humility, that softened his usual demeanor. He stepped into the room, letting the door close quietly behind him, and met her gaze, his eyes searching for the right words. "Dr. Carter," he began, his tone subdued, "I wanted to speak with you. I heard about the meeting, about what you shared with the board. I didn't realize yesterday that—" He trailed off, struggling with how to address the weight of his own actions. Renee observed him quietly, giving him space to gather his thoughts. She could see that this wasn't easy for him, that he was standing before her, not as the self-assured doctor she had met yesterday, but as someone confronting a hard truth about himself. "I wanted to apologize," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I dismissed you yesterday, and I see now how wrong that was. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. I didn't treat you with the respect or the attention you deserved, and I'm sorry." Renee nodded slowly, acknowledging his words. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "But I need you to understand that this apology can't be just words. There are so many patients who don't have the same voice or platform to make their experiences known. What happened yesterday can't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else." Dr. Richards looked down, absorbing her words, and nodded. "You're right. I let my biases get in the way, and I see now how damaging that can be. I want to do better, Dr. Carter. If there's anything I can do to help with the changes you propose today, I'd like to be a part of it. I need to be a part of it." Renee studied him for a moment, noting the sincerity in his expression. She saw a man grappling with his own shortcomings, someone who had been forced to confront the limitations of his perspective. It wasn't easy, she knew, but this moment held the possibility of growth. "Then start by listening," she said gently. "Listen to your patients, to their words, their expressions. Let them be more than symptoms on a chart. That's where it begins." He nodded, visibly humbled, and offered her a small, respectful bow of his head. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. I'll remember that." As he left the room, Renee felt a profound sense of closure. This experience, as painful as it had been, had sparked change, not just within the hospital, but within individuals too. She left the boardroom with a renewed sense of hope, knowing that the journey toward true, compassionate care had finally begun. Renee walked out of the boardroom, feeling lighter but deeply contemplative. The hospital corridors, so familiar yet recently tainted by her experience, now seemed to pulse with a new energy. Each staff member she passed felt like a part of this quiet, ongoing revolution, and she wondered how many of them would be willing to embrace the changes that were coming. She believed in the capacity for growth, but she also knew that transforming a culture wasn't simple. It would require vigilance, dedication, and the commitment of every individual who walked these halls. As she moved toward the exit, she noticed the young intern from the previous day standing at the nurse's station, flipping through charts. His face brightened when he saw her, and he took a step forward, as if eager to speak. Renee smiled warmly, approaching him. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice filled with genuine relief and respect. "I heard about the board meeting. Some of the other staff have been talking about it, how you shared your experience. I can't tell you how much that means to people here, especially those of us who see patients struggling to be heard every day." Renee nodded, touched by his sincerity. "I'm glad it's already having an impact. Change starts with awareness, with acknowledging that we can always do better." The intern's face softened. "Honestly, it's inspiring. It makes me feel like there's hope for all of us to grow, to be the kind of doctors patients can trust and rely on." "That's exactly what I wanted to achieve," she replied. "But it's going to take a lot of us to keep that momentum going. People like you, who care, who listen, are the foundation of this change." He looked at her with a quiet sense of pride, his posture straightening as he took in her words. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. I'll do my best to live up to that. And if there's ever anything you need help with, you know where to find me." Renee smiled, feeling a deep sense of hope for the future. "I'll hold you to that," she said warmly. "You're exactly the kind of doctor we need in this hospital." They exchanged a nod, a mutual acknowledgement of the journey ahead, and Renee turned to leave. As she walked toward the exit, her heart felt full, not just with relief, but with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't merely a victory over a single day's frustration. It was the beginning of a lasting change that could reshape everything she believed in. And as she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, confident that the seeds of transformation had truly been planted. As Renee stepped into the sunlight outside the hospital, she took a deep, grounding breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs and cleanse away the remnants of frustration and fatigue. The past 2 days had been a whirlwind of emotions, from feeling unseen and dismissed to finding the strength to speak out and instigate change. She felt a profound shift within herself, not just as a leader but as someone who had walked through the vulnerable experience of being a patient. This renewed understanding and empathy now pulsed through her, and she felt determined to carry it forward. Later that evening, as she sat in her quiet home reflecting on everything that had happened, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from the young intern, a simple line of gratitude. "Thank you for believing in the importance of listening to every voice, Dr. Carter. You've inspired more people than you realize." A warm smile spread across her face. The message, though brief, reassured her that the change she had sparked was already resonating, not only in the boardroom but also among the staff who interacted with patients daily. The intern's words reminded her that her role as a leader extended beyond policies and decisions. It was about embodying the principles she wanted to see reflected in the hospital's culture. The following days brought a series of follow-up meetings, each one focused on implementing the changes the board had agreed upon. Renee worked tirelessly, reviewing drafts for new policies on patient care, organizing staff training sessions on empathy and bias, and setting up a feedback system to allow patients a safe space to voice their experiences. She collaborated closely with other board members, ensuring that these changes weren't just superficial adjustments, but fundamental shifts that would have a lasting impact. Her days were filled with a renewed sense of purpose, and slowly, she began to notice subtle changes within the hospital. Doctors, nurses, and staff members greeted her differently, not with obligatory respect, but with a new understanding of her vision. Even Dr. Richards, whom she occasionally encountered in the hallways, would offer her a genuine nod, an acknowledgement of their shared commitment to do better. One afternoon, Renee decided to revisit the emergency department, the place where her journey had begun. She walked through the waiting area, observing quietly. The atmosphere felt different now. She saw staff members speaking kindly to patients, taking an extra moment to answer their questions, their faces open and attentive. It was a small change, but she knew that these shifts in behavior were the first steps toward building a culture of genuine empathy. As she watched the interactions around her, she felt a sense of peace. This was the hospital she had always envisioned, a place where patients could feel seen, respected, and cared for. As Renee continued her quiet observation in the emergency department, she felt an immense sense of fulfillment, but she knew there was more work ahead. Moving further into the department, she noticed a woman sitting alone, her hand pressed to her chest, her face contorted in discomfort. She looked familiar, perhaps a nurse or staff member Renee had encountered in passing. But at this moment, she was simply a patient, just as Renee had been not long ago. Renee approached her gently, kneeling beside the chair to meet the woman's gaze. "Are you all right? Has anyone seen you yet?" she asked softly. The woman looked up, her eyes grateful yet weary. "I've been waiting for a while. They said a doctor would be with me soon, but the pain it's getting worse." Without hesitation, Renee gave her a reassuring nod and stood up, glancing around until she spotted a nearby nurse. Approaching the nurse, she politely but firmly explained the situation, emphasizing the woman's visible discomfort. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who understood the system from both sides, advocating with compassion and respect. Within minutes, a doctor arrived to evaluate the woman, and Renee watched as her face softened in relief. The doctor listened attentively, asking questions and taking her symptoms seriously from the start. Renee could see the woman's gratitude in the way she relaxed, her trust gradually building as her concerns were acknowledged. As the doctor completed his initial assessment, he glanced over and noticed Renee standing nearby. A faint recognition crossed his face, and he nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Doctor Carter," he murmured, as if understanding that her presence alone had set a standard of care that everyone in the room could feel. Renee simply nodded back, humbled by the small yet significant change she had witnessed. She returned to the waiting area, taking a moment to sit quietly and reflect. This was the impact she had dreamed of. Not just policies on paper, but a real shift in how people treated one another. A living commitment to compassion woven into the hospital's fabric. Before leaving, she stopped by the nurse's station, where the young intern happened to be working. He looked up, surprised but pleased to see her. "Dr. Carter," he said with a smile, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I just wanted to observe," she replied with a gentle smile. "And it looks like things are changing for the better." The intern's smile widened. "That's because of you, Dr. Carter. You've reminded all of us what true care should look like." As she left the hospital that day, Renee's heart felt full, not only with the satisfaction of seeing her efforts bear fruit, but with the hope that this culture of empathy would continue to grow and flourish. She walked out into the sunlight, knowing that this was only the beginning. The hospital had become a place of healing again, not just in body but in spirit, and she was grateful to be a part of that transformation. In the weeks that followed, Renee observed the hospital's transformation unfold gradually, but steadily. Each day she received updates from various departments implementing the new policies. Reports showed improved patient satisfaction, and even staff morale had risen as they embraced a culture of empathy and respect. Renee could see that her experience had sparked something fundamental, an awareness that extended beyond just following procedures. One morning, she received an email from the hospital's patient advocacy office. They had compiled feedback from recent patients, and the responses were overwhelmingly positive. Patients noted feeling genuinely listened to, describing interactions where doctors and nurses had taken extra time to explain diagnoses, answer questions, and acknowledge concerns. The advocacy office mentioned a specific case, an elderly patient who had been in and out of the emergency room several times for chest pain. In the past, he'd been dismissed as having anxiety. This time, the staff had approached his symptoms with fresh eyes, ultimately diagnosing a heart condition that had been missed before. Renee felt a surge of pride reading these stories. Each one was a testament to the hospital's commitment to doing better, a reflection of the dedication she'd poured into these changes. But her attention was drawn to the last line of the report, a personal note from the head of the advocacy office, thanking her for her courage in sharing her own experience and inspiring a shift in how they approached patient care. Just as she finished reading, her office phone rang. It was Dr. Richards. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice carrying a warmth that was new and genuine. "I thought you'd want to know. I've been working with the interns, focusing on communication and patient empathy. It's been humbling but rewarding. I can see how much this new approach is helping, not only with patients but in how we feel about our work." Renee was pleasantly surprised. "That's wonderful to hear, Dr. Richards. I'm glad you've taken this on. It means a lot, not just to the patients, but to everyone who wants to see this hospital become a true place of healing." There was a pause, and then he replied, "Thank you, Dr. Carter, for giving us the push we needed. And thank you for holding me accountable. I'm learning more than I expected." After they ended the call, Renee sat back, feeling a sense of closure and profound fulfillment. The transformation was underway, reaching even those who had initially resisted. Her journey from being a patient dismissed in pain to the force behind this change had come full circle. As she glanced at the stack of files on her desk, she felt ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. She knew this was only the beginning, but she was confident now, more than ever, that the hospital was on the right path. The walls that had once echoed with her frustration were now alive with a renewed spirit of compassion and understanding. In the weeks that followed, Renee continued to oversee the hospital's transformation with both a meticulous eye and a hopeful heart. Changes were taking root, and the results were visible in the subtle yet powerful shifts she saw every day. Staff across all departments were embracing the new empathy training and patient feedback initiatives, not just as duties, but as opportunities to grow in their roles. From the emergency department to the specialist clinics, she saw firsthand how these new practices were shaping a more compassionate, patient-centered approach. There was a quiet, yet unmistakable ripple effect. People were beginning to feel empowered to speak up, to challenge outdated norms, and to prioritize true understanding over efficiency alone. One morning, as she prepared for her day, Renee received an email from the young intern, whose kindness had been a balm to her during her own painful experience in the ER. He wanted to share the story of a recent patient he'd treated, a woman who had come in with recurring abdominal pain. Previously, her symptoms had been dismissed as indigestion or stress, but with Renee's story still fresh in his mind, the intern chose to dig deeper. Through additional tests and close listening, he discovered that she had a rare, treatable condition that had gone undiagnosed for years. Renee felt an overwhelming sense of pride reading his email. The intern's attentiveness and willingness to challenge initial assumptions had made a profound difference in that patient's life. This was exactly the outcome she had envisioned, her experience inspiring real change, one interaction at a time. She replied to his message, expressing her gratitude for his dedication and reminding him that he was becoming the kind of doctor who could make lasting, positive impacts in the lives of his patients. Later that day, Renee attended a staff-wide meeting where new training modules on patient empathy and implicit bias were being introduced. She observed from the back of the room as doctors, nurses, administrative staff, and technicians leaned in, listening carefully to the trainers who explained the importance of seeing patients not as cases to solve, but as people with complex lives and unique stories. The trainers emphasized that every patient interaction was a chance to practice compassion, humility, and openness. As the staff began to engage in group exercises, discussing ways they could improve their own bedside manner, Renee could see a spark in their eyes, a genuine willingness to learn and grow. Toward the end of the session, the trainer invited Renee to speak, recognizing her as the catalyst for these changes. Standing before the assembled staff, she spoke from her heart, sharing her journey once more, this time with gratitude for each of them. "What you're doing here," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "is not just for me or any one patient. It's for all those who come through our doors seeking help, often feeling vulnerable or afraid. Your compassion, your willingness to listen, is what transforms this place from a hospital into a sanctuary." As she finished, she saw a mixture of respect and admiration on the faces of those around her. Many of them had heard snippets of her story, but seeing her there in person, fully invested in their development, made a lasting impact. When the meeting ended, several staff members approached her to express their commitment to the changes, each one reaffirming her belief that the hospital was finally on a path towards something truly meaningful. By the time Renee returned to her office, her mind was buzzing with ideas for further improvements. She envisioned patient mentorship programs, where former patients could share their experiences with new staff members, creating a continuous thread of empathy woven through each level of care. She thought of implementing routine patient experience reviews, which would allow hospital leadership to keep a pulse on the real-life impact of their policies. With each new idea, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her journey, while deeply personal, had the power to reshape the institution she cared so much about. As the day wound down, Renee took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. What had begun as a painful, isolating experience had blossomed into a movement of compassion, empathy, and accountability that was transforming lives. The hospital, once just a place where she worked, had become a space of healing and possibility, both for patients and for those who served them. Months passed, and the transformation that Renee had sparked became woven into the very fabric of the hospital's operations. Changes that had once seemed like radical shifts in practice were now simply part of everyday life. Staff members approached their work with a renewed sense of purpose, connecting more deeply with their patients and colleagues. The hospital had become a place where every person, doctor, nurse, patient, or visitor, was seen, heard, and valued. One afternoon, the hospital organized a formal gathering to honor Renee's contributions. It was a simple ceremony held in the hospital's atrium, with patients, staff, and board members in attendance. Word had spread about Renee's story and the impact of her experience, and people gathered not just to recognize her work, but to celebrate the changes that had blossomed because of it. Flowers adorned the room, and a quiet excitement hummed through the crowd. Renee stood at the front, accepting the small plaque they presented her, a modest token of appreciation, engraved with words that acknowledged her dedication to empathy and excellence in patient care. She held the plaque, feeling its weight in her hands, but knowing that the true reward lay in the transformed faces of those around her, the people who had embraced her vision. When it was her turn to speak, she took a moment to look around the room, pausing to make eye contact with the familiar faces she had come to cherish. She saw the young intern, now a confident and caring doctor, standing near the front, his eyes full of pride. Dr. Richards was there too, standing beside the nurses he had since come to respect as essential partners in patient care. In the back of the room, she noticed the elderly patient whose previously overlooked heart condition had been discovered, thanks to the culture of deeper listening she had inspired. Renee took a deep breath, her voice calm but resonant as she began. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today, for being a part of this journey. When I first experienced what it was like to be a patient here, I never imagined it would lead to such a profound shift. What I went through was challenging, yes, but it opened my eyes to the reality that so many others face daily. It made me realize that to make a difference, I had to speak up. And because of all of you, that message has become a movement. She paused, seeing her words sink in, and then continued. But the truth is, I didn't do this alone. Every one of you here has taken this vision and made it your own. You've shown up every day with a commitment to listen, to care, and to bring compassion into every interaction. You're the ones who made this possible. You turned a single story into a collective impact. The room was silent, but she could see emotion flickering across faces, a mixture of pride, humility, and inspiration. Renee continued, "What we've built here is more than policy, more than training. It's a culture of humanity, a place where people can feel safe, respected, and genuinely cared for, no matter who they are. I believe that this hospital, through your efforts, has become a model for others, a beacon of hope for patients who have lost faith in the system. And as we look toward the future, I am confident that the legacy of compassion will continue to grow, reaching those who need it most." When she finished, there was a brief pause, followed by a wave of applause that filled the atrium. People stood, clapping not only for her, but for each other, for the journey they had embarked on together. Renee felt a profound sense of connection in that moment, realizing that the hospital had become exactly what she had always envisioned, a place of healing not only for patients, but for everyone who worked there as well. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, several colleagues approached her, expressing their gratitude and admiration. She spoke with each one, listening to their stories of how the new approach had transformed their work and deepened their commitment to patient care. The young intern pulled her aside, a hint of awe in his voice as he said, "Dr. Carter, you didn't just change our hospital, you changed all of us. I think you've made us better people." Renee smiled, feeling the warmth of his words. "Thank you," she said, touched. "But remember, this isn't about me. It's about each of us doing what we can to make a difference every day. That's the real power of this work." As she left the hospital that evening, walking out under the fading light of dusk, Renee felt an immense peace settle over her. She knew that this wasn't just the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a legacy that would endure. She had found her voice, had used it to create something meaningful, and in doing so, had empowered others to do the same. The hospital would go on, as all places do, but it would carry forward the spirit of compassion she had fought to instill. And as Renee walked away, she felt lighter than she had in years, knowing that her experience, her story, had become a part of something much larger, a testament to the power of resilience, empathy, and the quiet strength of a voice that refuses to be silenced. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Let's keep the conversation going and inspire change together.